This is the 15th session of Old Testament Survey, and I'm very pleased to see so many people sticking with this. I know that there are a lot watching on the Zoom video as it's live, and many others are signing in on Facebook. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this with you. We'll know in years to come what the results will be, but I hope this lays a foundation for as many of you as possible in the study of the Bible. This is such an important thing for us to be able to do. This evening, we're going to continue in our study of the Old Testament with the study of the book of Exodus. Exodus. This is this is the second book of Moses, and is the first book in which Moses is a primary character. We're going to see Moses in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy, we get the report of Moses' death. So, of course, that was probably written by someone who followed Moses, but it's okay. The book of Exodus gets its title from Greek. The word Exodus means a departure. That's exactly what it means. If you travel over to Greece, in modern Greece, you'll see on the freeways there that the exit signs are labeled Exodus. And of course, it's marked in Greek. It's not in Latin characters, but that's what that says. My first time in Greece, I was a little amazed to realize that every time you get off the freeway, you're engaging in an exodus. You're taking the way out. The book of Exodus speaks of Israel coming out of the land of Egypt in order that they might be made into a nation that could be brought in to the land of Israel. So this introduces a theme that's going to continue all the way through Joshua, and some would argue through Judges, that Israel was brought out in order that they might be brought in. They are saved from the slavery, the background of Egypt, in order that they might be formed as a people who could serve God in a new place. They were brought out in order that they might be brought in. The climax of the book of Exodus is the giving of the law in the form of the Ten Commandments. And everything else that happens around that is a part of that main message. So I'm going to go to, let's see here if I can do this. Move this out of the way. I'm going to try to go back to screen sharing and get Exodus to come up. Yes, there it comes. Oh boy. This is the Sinai Peninsula. And there in the background, you'll see St. Catherine's Monastery. This is a Greek Orthodox monastery that was built in the 4th or so century after Christ. And it's named after a saint that I don't know anything about. The monks there insist that the mountain here is in fact the mountain of God, Mount Sinai. There are in fact 4 peaks nearby that are all high enough to be thought of as the major peak of the South Sinai wilderness. We don't know if any of those is the right place. There are good arguments, actually excellent modern conservative arguments for putting the Exodus along a northern route that never goes into the south of the Sinai at all. I'll show you a map later, and I'll show you what I mean by all of this. But this is the traditional site of the Exodus, and this is actually an excellent place to think about the Exodus and what it is and what's going on with it and all of this stuff. Let's that in the foreground, of course, is a camel. That camel is available to give people a ride to the top of Mount Sinai. Some people even come down on the camels. One of my people one year came down on the camel, and the camel stumbled down near the bottom of the mountain, and this man on the camel fell off, and the camel ran over the top of him. So I have tended to shy away from camels. I don't trust them. I know they're very nice, but I don't trust them. Okay, let me go on to second slide. Some introductory stuff. There's a bunch of stuff here that I'm going to go through just in case my aviation students have to listen to this particular episode. The title of the book is from the Septuagint. The term departure or exodos is the central theme of the book. It's really what it's all about. We conservatives believe that Moses wrote Exodus. That conclusion is consistent with both archaeological evidence and all of the biblical evidence. One of the most important bits of biblical evidence is that Jesus and the apostles routinely and many times refer to the first 5 books of the Old Testament as simply Moses. Is it not written in Moses? If Jesus believed that Moses wrote Exodus, who am I to have some other opinion? And yet the critics all have a different opinion. The date of the Exodus is one of the major critical problems of Old Testament studies. You will see this discussed in every commentary, absolutely every commentary. There are 3 positions that are taken. The correct or biblical position is that the date was 1446 BC. I say that this is the biblical position because Exodus itself tells us in, I believe, chapter 14, that the Exodus takes place 430 years after Jacob came down into Egypt. That was in 1876, but we know that because of the date of the Exodus. The key date for establishing the Exodus is later on in 1 Kings 6:1, where we see that Solomon began the construction, began the construction of the temple in 966 BC, which was 480 years after the Exodus. That puts the Exodus at 1446. All of those dates work very well with archaeology and with the rest of our chronology. It all fits together very nicely. The very specific archaeology, some thousands of individual bibliographic details, demonstrate that an early date for the Exodus, the 1446 date, makes very good sense. It's consistent with everything that we can dig up. Later on, we're going to look at the book of Judges, and I'm going to note in the book of Judges that that period is about 300 years long, and it runs from about 1400 BC until about 1100 BC, about 300 years. in order to have a later date for the Exodus, you have to deliberately shorten the period of the judges. Matter of fact, all kinds of things need to be moved around in order to have a later date for the Exodus. Now, the two counter ideas to the early date for the Exodus are called the late date and the no date theory. The late date is sometime in the 1200s. This is mainly built around archaeology. It was invented by an archaeologist in between the world wars, uh, W.F. Albright, brilliant man, the father of biblical archaeology, very, very important man, to whom we must almost always listen. He's a very, very good scholar, and yeah, even we conservatives believe that uh, that Albright is correct in most of his conclusions. But here in the date of the Exodus, Albright suggested that there were a whole bunch of cities that were destroyed around the middle of the 13th century, around 1250 to 1230 or so BC. Some 75 separate sites appear to have been destroyed during this period. There's no evidence that Israel destroyed them, but there are all these that were destroyed. And Albright says the Bible seems to describe a big war. So this must have been the time that Joshua destroyed the cities of Canaan. The Bible, though, is very explicit. When we get to the book of Joshua, I'll show you that the Bible only claims that Joshua burned 3 cities, not 70. He only burned 3, and they're very specifically mentioned: Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor. 3 specific cities, and I'll show you those on a map later. And we find evidence of a destruction of those 3 cities. Well, 2 of the 3 we're sure of. 2 of those 3 were destroyed around 1400 BC, which is consistent with an early date. All those other destructions later probably happened at the hands of a variety of different enemies during the period of the Judges. Judges period was a very unsettled time. So the late date is supported by an awful lot of scholars who typically have a very low view of Scripture. Now, there are some radical scholars, typically by radical I mean non-Christian, particularly Israeli Jews, who have taken the position that no Exodus took place at any time. Or whatever happened was not really an exodus. It was a rebellion of Canaanite peasants, or perhaps it was a peaceful migration of tribal peoples in from the desert. Whatever it was nothing to do with an exodus from Egypt or a conquest of the Promised Land. Uh, I don't hold to either of those last two. I hold that the date of the Exodus was 1446 because 1, that's what the Bible teaches, and 2, that's what Jesus seems to be implying. Jesus implies that this is all accurate history. And when I compare this history with all of the outside of the Bible, extra biblical evidence, I find that it's all consistent with an early date. There is no real good argument for the late date or the no date theory. And that's my opinion as a scholar. I'm not merely as a believer, but as a scholar. Now, the book of Exodus was probably composed during the wanderings in Sinai. It may have been while Moses was still at Mount Sinai after the giving of the law, or perhaps during the wanderings that we're going to see in the book of Numbers. Um, the oh, dum, 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 uh, yeah, I've said enough about authorship of the whole Pentateuch. Exodus, like the rest of the Pentateuch, was written by Moses, not by J, E, D, or P, or R2, or the rest of them. Um, Moses wrote all of this. By the way, this thing in the background is from Egypt. This is the Luxor Palace in Luxor, Egypt. It's quite the place. Those characters on either side of the door are Ramses II, sometimes called Ramses the Great. Ramses the Great was not the pharaoh of the Exodus. It was actually a fellow that most people don't know, whose name was Amenhotep. Uh, we'll get to him in a second. But anyway, this is a pharaoh, and that's a great big temple. It's really, really a very impressive place. Okay, let's go on to some dates and dynasties. And these are things that we don't really have to have, but we've got them anyway. The history of Egypt is divided up into three kingdoms with two intermediate periods. An intermediate period is a time of decline or eclipse for Egypt. And so the Old Kingdom is the earliest Egyptian history, going back to the earliest pharaohs that we have records of, from 2668 down to 2188. And this was the period of time in which the pyramids were built. So by the time Abraham got to Egypt, the most recent of those pyramids was already well over 100 years old. The first intermediate period is at the time of the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, at about the time that Abraham was coming out of Ur of the Chaldees. The whole world went into about a 200-year-long decline. And the reasons for that are undoubtedly complex, and we don't know most of that. The Middle Kingdom, or Middle Egypt, runs from about 1991 to 1786. And this is a time of tremendous prosperity. It begins with Sesostris I and continues with Sesostris II, who was the pharaoh under whom Joseph had his power. Sesostris II reigned over a very much revived Egypt and a reunited Egypt. It was during this period of time that we find Egypt laying the foundations for a world empire. And really, it's appropriate to say that Joseph set Egypt on a path to empire. It was his good administration that did that. The second intermediate period is famous in Egyptian history. It runs for the better part of 200 years, from 1786 to 1567. And is the period during which a people group called the Hyksos ruled in Egypt. They're also called shepherd kings. These Hyksos people came out of Syria somewhere. We know very little about their background. We know they had chariots. Perhaps in the background of this slide, you can see an Egyptian chariot. The Hyksos are the people who introduced chariots to Egypt. Prior to that, the Egyptians had never seen a chariot. The Hyksos were a Semitic people. We know that they wore beards and long hair. They kept sheep, or at least their servants kept sheep. They were not Egyptian at all, and they were a very small group, but they were a group of warlords. And as a military junta, they were able to control the civilian population of Egypt for 200 years. This was a time when Egypt was plundered and it was a very, very hard time. Beginning in 1567, there's a king called Ahmose the First, who decided to throw off the yoke of the Hyksos. He arranged a rebellion and pushed back against the Hyksos, finally driving them out by 1555, I believe, is the date often given. And from that time on, we call it the Egyptian New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom is when the Exodus is going to happen. From 1567 to 1150 is the high point of Egyptian world power. They came to a position where they were one of the three great powers in the ancient world. There were also the Hittites in what is today Turkey. There were the Mesopotamian power, who at the time were called the Mitanni. So Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, and Egypt finally come to maturity as world-class empires at this time. And little bitty Egypt is, or little bitty Israel is a tiny strip of ground in between these three great empires. It is the bridge between the great empires of the world. Much of the rest of Old Testament history is going to depend on that geographic and geopolitical truth. So there are a whole bunch of names here, and you have my permission to ignore these. You may as well. I'm not going to put these on a test, but there's some interesting correlations. If we take the biblical dates at face value, which I do, we find a bunch of interesting stuff. 1546, we see Amenhotep I putting the power together. Ahmose the First was the king before then. He pushed the Hyksos out and established the new kingdom. But we've got Amenhotep I, who consolidates power. Thutmose the First, born in 1526, reigned for 14 years. And he was born the same year as Moses. Moses had to have been born about 1526. So that means that the pharaoh of the oppression had to have been either Amenhotep I or Thutmose I. It could be back as far as Ahmose, but probably one of these. The pharaoh who insisted on the death of the firstborn would have been Thutmose I. Now, very significantly, the daughter of Thutmose was a lady by the name of Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is significant in that she is the only really well-known, the really prominent woman in the entire history of Egypt. There was never a queen until Greco-Roman times. We've got Cleopatra 2,000 years later, but this queen is Hatshepsut. She's a very, very interesting character. She had what the Jewish people call chutzpah. She insisted on getting whatever it was she wanted. She had a very strong mind and insisted on taking control of whatever she got close to. Hatshepsut has the distinction of being the only woman who rose to power as a usurper in Egyptian history. When her nephew Tutmos the third became king, which would have been in 1504, he was still too young. And Hatshepsut actually reigned as queen until her death in 1482. So those early years, some 22 years of Tutmosis III's reign, were under the control of Hatshepsut. When Hatshepsut died, she was buried not in the Valley of the Queens or the Valley of the Nobles. She was buried in the Valley of the Kings. And her mortuary temple is the largest temple in the Valley of the Kings. It's fascinating stuff. I believe that Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I, was the daughter of Pharaoh who found Moses in the river. There's very few other ways we could possibly understand that whole thing. Now, Thutmose III, who reigned for these 46 or 44 years, 54 years, 40, yeah, 54 years, reigned a long time. Thutmose III would have been somewhat younger than Moses, but they would be roughly contemporaries. It's quite likely that Moses grew up in the palace in Egypt along with Thutmose III. So they would have known one another, and they would obviously have been rivals. Thutmose III, the son of Thutmose II, would have been the next king of Egypt. But I almost guarantee, we don't have written documentation of this, but I would almost guarantee that Hatshepsut would have insisted that Moses, our Moses, be the next king of Egypt. So a whole lot of fascinating byplay. And with that story, we have this potential for conflict. Was Tutmosis III the pharaoh of the Exodus? Well, no, he couldn't have been. And I'll show you why as we get into farther into Exodus. Amenhotep II reigned from 1450 until 1425. That would make him the pharaoh of the Exodus. We know that Amenhotep II lost his army, his chariots, and large numbers of men. This period of Egyptian history was a hard time for the Egyptian military. We find no records of any great expeditions during this period. Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Thutmose IV, it's strange the way these names are, they've all got the same name, but Thutmose IV reigned after Amenhotep II. He was the son of Amenhotep II. And he is famous for a thing called the dream stele. The dream stele is a stone tablet that's found in between the legs of the Sphinx there at the Giza Pyramids area. And the most important thing about the dream stele, this was written by Amenhotep or by Thutmose IV, and a summary. This is my own really bad translation, but it's accurate. Thutmose IV says, even though I am not the firstborn of my father, the Pharaoh, the Sphinx told me in a dream, if I would clear out the sand from the base of the Sphinx, that I would become the Pharaoh of Egypt. Even though he's not the firstborn, he would become the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, who was the firstborn and what happened to him? So Amenhotep, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, had a firstborn son, but he didn't become the Pharaoh. Tutmosis IV did instead. What happened? Well, the Bible tells us the 10th plague is the Passover of the death angel through Egypt. And the firstborn of every family, the firstborn of the flock and the herd, and the firstborn of every family, from the slave to the palace. Amenhotep II lost his firstborn son in the Passover. That meant that Thutmose IV became the next pharaoh. Amenhotep III was the pharaoh during the time of the Exodus, and then very interestingly, Amenhotep IV, very fascinating character, was the pharaoh of what we call the Amarna age. During that period of time, we hear stories about a strange group of people who have come out of the desert and are taking over the cities of Canaan. Who could these possibly be? The Canaanites named them the Habiru. Now, there were a lot of Habiru around. We'll talk a little bit more about them later on. But the Habiru are mentioned in several dozen letters home to Egypt. Dear Pharaoh, I kiss your ring. I bow before you. You should know that things are tough here and we could use another chariot or two. There are bad people coming out of the desert. These Habiru have crossed over from the desert into our lands, and they are taking the lands of the king, my lord. So you should send us another dozen arrows and perhaps a sword or two, so that we can survive and not stop paying taxes to you. The Amarna letters are fascinating. And we find a collection of some 300 of these letters from the kings of Canaan to the pharaohs of Egypt during the time of Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV, all during this period of time. All of this is to go together to say that the early date for the Exodus and the historicity of the Exodus is broadly demonstrated by the archaeological evidence. We have lots and lots of history, lots and lots of details, lots and lots of artifacts that demonstrate this thing. Now, in the background there, you see a hieroglyph. Hieroglyphics is the Egyptian way of writing. It was only done on monuments and big steles and things that the Egyptians put up for political purposes mostly. And this thing that you see in the background is a hornet. Now, in the book of Leviticus, I believe, and in the book of Joshua, in 3 separate places, God promises that he will send the hornet in front of Israel to clear the land, clear the way for them to take the promised land. The hornet is the hieroglyphic symbol of Thutmose III. Thutmose III was the great conqueror of Syria and Palestine. He's the one who brought Egypt to the greatest extent of power and prosperity. He was the builder. And certainly he was the oppressor of the Jewish people at that time. We find the kinglets, the Canaanite kinglets of Canaan, divided against one another and strongly allied and serving Thutmose III. It's a fascinating bit of history. Okay, let's go on to an outline of the book of Exodus. It really divides up into 2 parts. Today we're going to try to get through the first 18 chapters. Yeah, Donna is back of me here laughing at that possibility. It may or may not happen. We'll give it a try. The first 18 chapters take Israel out of Egypt. So this is the redemption of God's people from Egypt. And the second part of the book, 19 through 40, is the revelation to God's people at Sinai. So this is the giving of the Ten Commandments and then all of the other elements of this that go along with it. The redemption of God's people actually begins right at the beginning. Here's a sunset in Egypt. One of the things you'll notice about Egypt, no matter where you are, you can see the desert. So I'm actually I think I'm in a hotel in Cairo, and I'm shooting with a long lens toward the sunset. Sunset's in the west, so I'm shooting out toward the west into the Sahara Desert. And there in the distance, you can see the sun just touching the sand. And in the foreground, the palm trees of the Nile River. So things start out, chapter 1, with the oppression. Okay, and I've got a hyperlink coming up, so I'm going to have to take a look at that. Chapter 1 um, starts right out. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, and we get a list of the names, and 70 persons. And Joseph was already there, and then Joseph died, and all the brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased and multiplied, so that the land was filled with them, which is a good thing. And there arose a new king who did not know Joseph. Now, we don't know who the new king who didn't know Joseph was. The Bible doesn't tell us, just that there was a new king who didn't know Joseph. This would be some years later. Some scholars have argued that the oppression begins almost immediately, 50 years or so after Joseph. I think that's possible. It could be that the oppression began with the Hyksos. I rather don't think so. I think that Exodus is talking about a pharaoh who's much closer to that time, after the pushing out of the Hyksos, perhaps almost the first, perhaps one of the Amenhoteps. Uh, the Bible doesn't tell us, and it's hard to deduce it. But anyway, this king, this pharaoh, decided that Israel was a threat. They're getting to be too many for us, so let's deal shrewdly with them. So they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And here we see a tomb painting of slaves making bricks. This is actually pretty good technical description of how the bricks are made. On the left side, you see them gathering water out of a pool. In the bottom center, you see them mixing the mud to make the bricks. Next to that, you see them carrying it with buckets. In the upper right, they're taking those buckets and dumping the clay into forms. On the far left, you see a man stacking the bricks for drying. In the lower right, you see a man with a right angle checking for level on the wall that's being built. Uh, it's all very interesting. This is a process that was done in the ancient world and is still done today. I was in Egypt a couple of times and noticed that the country people still make mud bricks. It's still a viable construction method. Now they do use straw to make bricks. They always have. And the straw is cut up into really small pieces, what we would think of as chaff or dust. And that straw bits is mixed with the clay. It doesn't work like rebar. It works more uh, like a strengthener. It changes the chemical composition of the clay and makes makes the clay tougher. Without the straw, bricks tend to be brittle and they'll break without too much effort. If the bricks are breaking, the buildings fall down and nobody's very happy. We're going to see that later on. Okay, even so, there were too many Israelites. So the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, if it's a son, kill him. But if a daughter, he shall live, or she shall live. Okay, so you're going to kill the boy babies of the Hebrews. And Shiphrah and Puah didn't cooperate. They decided to save the boy babies. And along the way, that's an interesting story. And when we think about how many people there were in Israel at this time, and in Egypt for that matter, we know there were a bunch of them. But how many were there? Really, were there millions of them? If there were millions of them, how come two midwives could do the job for everybody? It was probably a smaller number. That's a different issue, and I think I'll come back at a later time to talk about the problem of big numbers in the Old Testament. We'll come to that, and I'll address that one. So we go on to the story of Moses. So all of this is going on. There was a man from the house of Levi went and took a wife of a Levite woman. She conceived and bore a son, and he was a fine child. And she hid him for 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with tar and with pitch. Put the child in it, placed it among the reeds of the riverbank, and his sister, whose name is Miriam, stood not too far away to know what would happen. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river with her young women alongside the river and saw the basket, sent her servant women to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and she said to herself, "This is one of the Hebrew children." And then his sister said, Sister Miriam, said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from among the Hebrew women?" And Pharaoh's daughter thought that sounded like a good idea. The girl went and called the child's mother. So Moses' mother, along with most likely the rest of the family, ended up with Moses in Pharaoh's palace, a part of the household staff as Moses grew up. And it was Pharaoh's daughter who names Moses. The word Moshe means to draw out. She said, "I drew him out of the water, so I'm going to name him Moses, Moshe." The name Tutmosis is from the same root. Tutmosis means the god Tut draws out. So it's the same basic name. One day when Moses had grown up, this is 2:11, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And here we have this story introduced in chapter 2. There in the background is the palace of Hatshepsut. You see that thing? That is really large, and that's at the entrance to the Valley of the Kings. Very, very big palace with lots and lots of statues of Hatshepsut, which interestingly enough have been defaced. The other interesting thing about the statues of Hatshepsut is that they all have beards. now, either Hatshepsut managed an ancient miracle and grew a beard, or she wanted to portray herself as a male pharaoh. It's a fascinating story. There's an awful lot we don't know, but this has got to be the foster mother of Moses. So one day Moses was grown up, and he went out to his people. He looked on their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people, and he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, that's not a good thing to do. Generally speaking, murder is considered a bad move. Uh, but Moses did that, hid him in the sand. And the next day, behold, there were two Hebrews struggling with each other. And Moses said to the man in the wrong, why are you striking your companion? And the man answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you did the Egyptian? Ah, so at this point, Moses thought that the thing had become known, and he decided this was a good time to get out of Egypt. Pharaoh heard of it rapidly. He sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh, stayed in the land of Midian, and sat down by a well. And it's here that Moses is going to meet the lady who would be his wife, one Zipporah. So Moses has run away from Egypt and settled in the land of Midian, which is generally the Sinai and the western part of Arabia. All of that is Midian. Same general area that Job lived. And so he finds the shepherdess comes, he marries Zipporah. The father-in-law is a man named Jethro, and he's a fascinating character. He's after the order of Melchizedek, another Gentile, a godly man, a believer, who honestly knows God. And here again, we see the meeting of general revelation on the part of Jethro and special revelation on the part of Moses. And the two are cooperative. They aid and abet one another. Okay. The end of chapter 2 at verse 23, we're told, during those many days, the king of Egypt died. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now, if we figure things out, if we look at the biblical chronology for all of this, we get a lifespan from Moses of about 120 years. So he was born in 1526, and 40 years later is about the time that he murders the Egyptian and flees into the wilderness. He stays in the wilderness throughout the entire independent reign of Tutmosis III. This would be the pharaoh at the time. During these many days, that pharaoh continued to live and reigned independently of Hatshepsut. And during all of that time, Moses stayed out in the wilderness. And we know that that was about 40 years. So the pharaoh of the Exodus has to be the pharaoh who follows a pharaoh who reigned a long, long time. 40 years is a long time. Most pharaohs reign on the average of 8 to 12 years. And that's what we see historically. Tutmosis III is the first king of the 18th dynasty to reign as long as 40 years. The next time that there is a king who reigns a long time is Ramses II. Ramses II also reigned 40 years, or a little bit longer. And so those arguments that say that Ramses II has to be the pharaoh of the Exodus are missing this argument. Ramses II couldn't possibly be the pharaoh of the Exodus. It would have to be the next king after, who was named Merneptah. The son of Ramses II is Merneptah, and Merneptah is the wrong one. He can't be the Pharaoh of the Exodus or of the conquest, because Merneptah uh, reports the presence of Israel in the Promised Land, and he also reports that he destroyed Israel. It's unlikely that that's how that happened. Okay, so all of that is happening, and during those many years, King of Egypt died. The people groaned. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now, I want to emphasize those four descriptions because it's at the core of how God is different from the gods of the pagans, the gods of the Egyptians. The Egyptian gods were pictures on tomb walls, they were statues, they were idols. And even the Egyptians, for the most part, knew better than to pray to these gods or expect deliverance from their gods. The gods of the Egyptians were perhaps capable of doing some damage, but they could not ever help anybody. They didn't make promises, they didn't keep promises, they didn't hear, they didn't care, they didn't know. But God does. So all these days, and God heard their groaning. He remembered his covenant. He saw the people, and he knew what was happening. The personality of God comes out, or what sometimes we call the personhood. God is real. He is a real person. He interacts with his people as a person would. And so Moses was keeping the flock of Jethro, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, another name for Sinai, the mountain of God. So this is 3:1. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And of course, people wonder, where is that burning bush? Wouldn't it be interesting to find a burning bush like that? And so here on the left, on Mount Sinai, or at the foot of Mount Sinai in St. Catherine's Monastery, inside the courtyard of the monastery, is the burning bush. We are assured that that bush that you see on the left side of the screen is in fact the very same bush that 3,500 years ago was burning for Moses. You can see that it has recovered nicely from the fire. Uh, um, it's okay. Maybe it's not the same bush. One of the things that I find very, very interesting, you can see people there in the background. You can see how large this bush really is. In those little windows that you see underneath the bush, the Greek Orthodox pilgrims often will light candles. So there'll be a whole string of these little candles burning underneath the bush. And I often worry that there might be a really dry summer one of these years, and the bush will catch fire. Uh, and then it really would be a burning bush, but that's beside the point. Okay, during that episode, this is a miracle. Moses said, "I've got to go see what this is," and Moses saw that he turned aside to see, or God saw he turned aside. He called to him, "Moses, Moses." He said, "Here I am." They said, "Don't come nearer. Take your sandals off. You're on holy ground." He said, "I am the God of your father, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Moses hid his face. And the Lord said, "I've seen the affliction. I've heard their cry. I know their sufferings. I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians." Oh, Moses must have been pretty happy about that. You know, I've heard, I've seen, I care, I remember, I've come down. And Moses is expecting God to grab a great big club and beat up on the Egyptians and send the Israelites packing. And about this time, Moses is probably wondering, so why are we having this conversation? This is nice to know, but why are you talking to me? And God says in verse 10, behold, come, I will send you to the Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now, here's a very, very important point. When God intends to do a mighty work, he normally uses one of his people. God does his mighty works in the world and in history through those of his people who are ready to help, who he has raised up to do the job. This is a fascinating thing. So God says, I'm going to send you. And Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And God responded, I will go with you. Yeah, catch that because all of the details matter. Uh, God says, I'm about to set the people free. So you go. I'm sending you. Moses says, who am I? And God's answer is, it really doesn't matter who you are, Moses, because I will go with you. That's going to end up being really important. So Moses is still not so sure. Moses said that if I come to the people of Israel and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what's his name? What shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said further, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Okay, this is a fairly important introduction because it's the introduction of the name of God, which is Yahweh. You can see that here on the screen. And I'm going to see if I can get into a hyperlink. This should work. Oops, it doesn't want me to get into that. So I'm not going to get that hyperlink, which is a bit of a pain. So I'm going to open up I'm going to stop this share and I'm going to get another one going. Yeah, let's see if I can get this down. And we'll set up the whiteboard. Bingo, here we are. God says, you should call me I am. I am that I am. Or I am what I am, or I am because I am. Echya, Esher, Echya is how it comes out in Hebrew. The key here is the phrase, the simple phrase, I am, right there, I am. And if you take that I am and change it into a kind of participle, it comes out in Hebrew looking like this, Y, H, W, H. So here it is, Y, H, W, H. And people always ask, well, you know, how do you pronounce that? And this is one of the really fascinating things about Old Testament studies. In our Hebrew Bibles, the name of God, YHWH, is unpronounceable. It is given vowels by the Masoretes that make it impossible to pronounce the word. And that's because the third commandment says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God, you shall not take the name, Yahweh, your God, for shava, for emptiness, for in vain. And so the people of Israel the rabbis decided that the safest thing would be to never use the name of God at all, ever. And the best way to do that is to remove the vowels so that people are reminded, I can't pronounce this word. Well, okay, be that as it may. God says, this is my name forever. This should be a memorial to you in all your generations. It seems to me that we ought to be able to pronounce the word. The question becomes, how shall it be pronounced? Well, it turns out that one of the most common ways. What happened here? There it is. Oh, sorry about that. The most common ending for theophoric names in the Old Testament is YAH. Sometimes YAHU, Yahoo, but just Yah. So the first part of the name of God has an A in it, YAH. Probably the H has under it what we call a shavah. The syllable should stop with H. Now, it might not. There might be a long O sound or a long U sound. In which case, that's a good thing for Martin Luther. The second part of it, from what's called vowel harmony, should have an E in it. So we would pronounce this Yahweh, 2 syllables, Yahweh. Now, during the Reformation, tradition has it that Martin Luther wanted to be able to provide a pronounceable name for God in the German translation of the Bible that he produced. And he knew that the name for God in the Old Testament is YHWH, and that when the Jews come to that word, they pronounce that Adonai. And Adonai, of course, has an A and an O and an AI. So, according to the tradition now, Martin Luther took I'll use another color here. Let's use blue. We take the Y, and in German that becomes a J. The A from Adonai is taken, and in German, because of vowel harmony, that becomes an E. The H becomes an H. The O from Adonai becomes an O, and the W in German becomes a V. The AI becomes an E, and the H is here. So the word Jehovah is produced. Now, there's just the slightest chance that the word Yahweh could have been pronounced Yehovah. It's possible. And so Martin Luther may have been right by accident. But taking the vowels from one word and combining them with another word that's a completely different word is hardly ever a good procedure. But that's where that came from. The word Yahweh is from the verb I am. Over in the New Testament, when Jesus is speaking of himself, he says, I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. Look at this word, I am. This is a very common, this is the first person singular of the verb to be, very common word. And it implies I am, I continue to be. It's the present tense. Before Abraham was, I am. Jesus was claiming to be the eternally existent one. God says to Moses, I am because I am, or something like that. I exist because I exist. God does not say, I am he who came to be. I have no beginning. God does not say, I will be for a while. He has no ending. God is eternal. He has existence in himself. It is in God's nature to exist. It's impossible for him not to exist. And so, done with that. Okay, click, and we're back to, now you're having to put up with me for a little bit. Here we are, coming to the end of chapter 3. God says, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. The God who exists has sent me to you. And Moses continues to argue, and this is going to go on for a little while. In chapter 4, Moses says, well, they're not going to believe me. Who am I? I don't speak well. I'm not very smart. I'm just a shepherd. So the Lord said to him, what's that you've got? What's that in your hand? And Moses looked over at what he had in his hand, which was a shepherd's staff. He said, well, I've got this stick here. Now, the stick that Moses had, don't be visualizing Gandalf with a powerful wizard staff that he's going to do kung fu with. Moses had picked up a stick along the path. It was a stick. You use it to thump a sheep if you need to. A shepherd picks up a stick to do the work. And Moses said, this is it. This is what I've got in my hand. I've got this stick. And God looked at the stick. He said, good, we'll start with that. Here's what I want you to understand. When God intends to do a mighty work in the world, he works through his people. When the people of God are willing to do the will of God, are willing to go and accomplish what God has laid out for them, God works through them. He promises to be with them. And then he begins the work with whatever they can bring to the party. What have you got in your hand? I've got a stick. What have you got in your hand? I'm a mechanic. What have you got in your hand? I'm a doctor. What have you got there? What can you bring with you? I'm a housewife. I'm a prayer warrior. I'm a janitor. I'm a caregiver in a nursing home. What have you got in your hand? Whatever you've got in your hand, God can use that to do his mighty works. I want you to understand that, because all of us have all the excuses we could possibly need for not doing the will of God in our lives. We don't want to be a part of the ministry. We don't want to be a part of the work. We don't want to go and do some great thing, because who are we and what have we got to offer? God says, it doesn't matter who you are, I will go with you. And it doesn't matter what you have to offer, we'll start with that. We'll take your stick and turn it into miracles. And the next great part of this story is going to go on like that. And I'm going to have to quit pretty quick here. Moses is given some powerful signs. So God says, what have you got in your hand? He says, well, I've got this stick. That's what God says, throw it on the ground. And he threw it on the ground and it became a snake. And Moses ran from it, and the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand, he caught it, and it became a stick again. that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to you. And God gave him another sign. He put his hand in his cloak, and it came out leprous, put it back, and it cleaned up. God gave Moses miracles. Moses is the first of the biblical characters to be given the power of the mediated miracle. 3 times in biblical history, there are occurrences of miracles in the sense of Moses' miracles. Turn a stick into a snake, cross the Red Sea, knock down the walls of Jericho. During the time of Moses and Joshua, we see this first long episode in the founding of the nation of Israel. The second episode of miracles doesn't come for almost 700 years later during the ministry of Elijah and Elisha, at the beginning of the period that we call the prophets of the Old Testament. The next great time of miracles is during the time of Christ and the apostles. I'm going to make a point here that I think is very important. We need to be careful with how we speak of miracles. Certainly, God does great works. When God answers prayer, uh, when God allows me to accomplish something that I didn't think was possible. Like, I remember looking for a parking place in downtown Rome, and there appeared a place on the sidewalk where I could pull in sideways. That takes an act of God. That's as close to a Class A miracle as they come. If I'd been able to predict that ahead of time, I would be considered a prophet. God answers prayer. God sometimes heals us in response to prayer or for his own good purposes. Those are not miracles in the biblical sense. Those are acts of God, and they're wonderful, and we should praise God for them. But those aren't miracles in the technical sense. The technical miracle, what I call a Class A biblical miracle, is an apparent violation of natural law that results in the authentication of God's messenger, like Moses, and God's message. I'm going to say that again. The Class A biblical miracle, in the technical sense, is an apparent violation of natural law, like a stick turning into a snake or the waters parting. An apparent violation of natural law that serves to authenticate God's messenger and God's message through that messenger. We always see those things working together. Every time there's a miracle in the primary sense, we don't usually see this. We don't see the term used of other acts of God. Simple answers to prayer are never called miracle. So we believers ought to be careful with our vocabulary. When a baby is born, that's a wonderful thing, but it's not a miracle. Uh, it's wonderful. It's an act of God and His design, and we should praise Him for it. And I'm not arguing that, but that's not a miracle. When God parted the Red Sea, which we're going to see on what day of the week is this? This is Wednesday. On Friday, we'll see the Red Sea. Uh, I'm not quite into dementia yet, but I'm getting close. Uh, one of these days, I'll have to have a calendar up on my wall so I remember what day of the week it is. When we see the crossing of the Red Sea, that's a miracle. And when God does a miracle, everybody who sees it recognizes this is what this is. There is a God in heaven who has called Israel out of the land of Egypt to save them and to establish them as a country that they might be brought in to the place that God has promised. And that's where we're at. Okay, this is where we'll quit for today. Here I thought I was going to get, yes. And why did your wife laugh? Oh, she didn't laugh. Yes, yes, indeed, she laughed. But I'll be back on Friday, and we'll see who gets the last laugh. Right? Okay, let me get everybody back unmuted again, so we can all talk. Okay. Bye, bye, everybody. We'll see you on Wednesday or on Friday. Love you all. Bye, bye,
Thank you.
Eddie. Bye, Dolly.
Thank you so much,
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Jen.
everybody. We'll see all of you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Can hardly wait till I can get to Italy. Yeah, we'll come. Don't know when, but we'll come. Okay, bye bye everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much, Dr.
Bye
John
bye.
and Mr.
Thank you
Dana.
so much. Arrivederci.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.